What happens when a broken woman collapses on the bed of the most dangerous man in Seoul? When Bruises tells stories she's too afraid to speak out loud, and the one person who finds her is someone who's never known mercy until now. Roh Se-won wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to feel anything at all. But the moment he walked into his bedroom and saw Rina lying there, battered and unconscious, something inside him cracked wide open. She was just the maid. She'd only been working for him for 4 months. He barely knew her name. And yet, in that single frozen moment, everything changed. Because men like him don't fall in love. They conquer, they control, they destroy. But when it comes to her, he's about to break every rule he's ever lived by. And this is the story of how it all began, with a girl too tired to run and a monster who decided she was worth becoming human for. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you love intense mafia romance, slow burn tension, and stories that make your heart race, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. Rina had been scrubbing floors since 5 in the morning. Her hands ached from gripping the brush too tightly, her knuckles raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals she'd been using without gloves because she'd forgotten to restock them. Her knees throbbed from kneeling on marble that seemed specifically designed to punish anyone who dared touch it. But she kept going, kept moving through the massive penthouse like a ghost, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling the phantom grip of his hands around her throat from the night before. She'd escaped Marcus 3 months ago, packed a single bag in the dead of night while he'd been passed out drunk, left everything behind, her apartment, her friends, the life she'd tried so desperately to build in a country that had never quite felt like home. She'd found work through a contact who owed her a favor, someone who specialized in asking no questions and expected the same courtesy in return. The job was simple enough: clean the penthouse of a man who was rarely home, keep her head down, don't ask questions, don't make unnecessary eye contact, and collect her paycheck every 2 weeks in cash. No paper trail, no records, no digital footprint. Perfect for someone who needed to disappear completely. For 4 months, it worked beautifully. Roh Se-won was a ghost in his own home, a phantom who occasionally materialized in expensive suits and disappeared just as quickly. She'd see him maybe twice a week, always impeccably dressed, always on the phone speaking rapid Korean in a voice that commanded immediate obedience, always moving like a man who had calculated every second of his day and had no time for anything that didn't serve a direct purpose. He never spoke to her directly, never looked at her longer than a passing glance, never acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional nod when they passed in the hallway. To him, she was invisible, a piece of furniture that happened to move and clean and exist on the periphery of his carefully controlled world. And that was exactly how she needed it to be. But last night, everything had shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Marcus had found her. She still didn't know how. She'd been so careful, so meticulous in covering her tracks, changed her phone number twice, deleted every social media account she'd ever created, avoided her old neighborhood like it was contaminated ground, paid for everything in cash, never used her real name except on the employment papers she'd been legally required to provide, and even those had gone through channels that were supposed to be secure. But somehow, Marcus Delano had tracked her down outside the corner grocery store where she bought her weekly supplies. He'd grabbed her by the arm before she could react, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force, and dragged her into the narrow alley beside the building before she could scream for help. The argument had been vicious and ugly. His accusations had come fast and sharp, each word designed to cut, to wound, to remind her that she belonged to him, and running had been a mistake she'd pay for eventually. He'd called her ungrateful, stupid, worthless, said she'd never survive without him, said no one else would ever want her damaged, broken self. And when she tried to pull away, when she'd found the courage to tell him she was done, that she'd never come back, that he didn't own her anymore, his fists had done the rest of the talking. But this time had been different. This time, Rena had fought back. The old Rena would have curled up and taken it, would have apologized for making him angry, would have promised to be better, to do better, to be whatever he needed her to be. But something had changed in these 4 months of freedom and silence and learning to exist without fear dictating her every move. Something had hardened into steel in her spine. So she'd clawed at his face, drawn blood from his cheek with her nails, kicked him hard enough in the shin to make him stumble and curse viciously. And then she'd run until her lungs burned and her vision blurred and her legs threatened to give out beneath her. She'd run through streets she barely recognized, taking random turns, doubling back on herself, doing everything she could to make sure he couldn't follow her trail. By the time she'd made it back to the penthouse building, it was nearly 3 in the morning. Her face was swelling. Her ribs ached where his fists had connected repeatedly. Her head was pounding from where he'd slammed her against the brick wall. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip her keys. She should have gone straight to her small room in the staff quarters on the ground floor, should have locked the door and collapsed on her narrow bed and let herself fall apart in private where no one could see her weakness. But she wasn't thinking clearly. Pain and fear had scrambled her thoughts, and she just needed to finish her work before Mr. Rowe came home and noticed anything out of place. Because losing this job meant losing her safety, her security, her sanctuary, and she couldn't afford that. So she'd taken the service elevator up to the penthouse, let herself in with her keycard, and gone straight to his bedroom, to dust the shelves one final time, to straighten the pillows and smooth the covers, just to make sure everything was absolutely perfect, just for a moment of rest before she went back downstairs. But the bed looked so soft, so inviting, and her body had felt so heavy, like every bone had turned to lead, like gravity had suddenly increased tenfold. And before she knew what she was doing, she'd sat down on the edge of the mattress, just for a second, just to catch her breath and let the dizziness pass, and then her eyes had closed, and she hadn't woken up. Rowe Se-Guan didn't expect to find anyone in his room when he returned home at 6 in the morning. He never did. The penthouse was his sanctuary, his fortress, the one place in Seoul where he could shed the weight of the empire he controlled with an iron fist, the blood that stained his hands no matter how many times he washed them, the enemies circling like vultures, waiting for him to show even a moment of weakness. He trusted no one, let no one into his private spaces, and the few people who worked for him knew better than to enter his bedroom uninvited. It was an unspoken rule, one that had never needed to be stated out loud, because the consequences of violating it were understood implicitly. So when he pushed open the door expecting darkness and solitude and saw a figure lying on his bed, his hand went to the gun at his waist before his brain could fully process what he was seeing. But then he saw her face. Rena, the maid, the quiet one who never made eye contact, who moved through his home like a shadow designed to go unnoticed, who moved with an efficiency that spoke of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible as a survival mechanism, who he'd barely spoken to in 4 months because she seemed so determined to remain unseen that acknowledging her felt like a violation of some unspoken agreement between them. She was curled on her side, one arm tucked under her head, her dark curls spilling across his white pillows like ink spreading across fresh snow. Her gray uniform was wrinkled and stained. Her shoes were still on, leaving faint dirt marks on his pristine white comforter. For a moment, he almost turned and walked out, let her sleep, fire her later for the intrusion, or perhaps just ignore it entirely and pretend it had never happened. He had bigger problems to deal with, a shipment that had gone missing, a rival family making moves into his territory, a politician who needed convincing to stay bought. But then he saw the bruises. Deep purple marks across her cheekbone, dark and angry against her brown skin, a split lip, swollen and crusted with dried blood that had run down her chin, finger-shaped bruises around her throat, 4 distinct marks on one side, a thumbprint on the other, telling a story he recognized all too well. Scratches on her arms, defensive wounds that indicated she'd fought back against whoever had done this to her, a dark stain on her gray uniform that looked too much like blood. Segwon's entire body went very still. He moved closer, his footsteps making no sound on the plush carpet despite his size. He crouched beside the bed, bringing himself eye-level with her sleeping form. Up close, he could see more details. The shallow rise and fall of her chest, slightly irregular like breathing hurt. The way her brow furrowed even in sleep, like her dreams offered no escape from whatever had put those marks on her skin. The faint tremor in her hands. The tear tracks dried on her cheeks. The way she'd unconsciously curled into herself, making her body as small as possible, a defensive posture that spoke of long-practiced survival instincts. Someone had hurt her, badly, and something cold and utterly unfamiliar twisted in his chest, something that felt uncomfortably close to concern, to anger, to a protective instinct he'd thought he'd buried years ago when he'd learned that caring about people was a liability in his world. He didn't know why he cared, didn't know why the sight of her bruised face made his pulse spike with a kind of fury he usually reserved for traitors and rivals who thought they could take what was his. She was just an employee, just a woman who cleaned his floors and avoided his gaze, and existed on the periphery of his life, someone he'd barely registered as a person rather than a function. But she was in his bed, bleeding, broken, and for reasons he didn't understand and wasn't ready to examine, that made her his responsibility. "Rena," Segwon said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't stir. He reached out, hesitated for a fraction of a second as he considered whether touching her would make things worse, then placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Her skin was warm through the thin fabric of her uniform. "Rena." Her eyes flew open. For a moment, she just stared at him, wide-eyed and disoriented, like she couldn't quite place where she was or who he was. Her breathing quickened, panic rising visibly in her expression. Then recognition hit, and absolute terror followed immediately after. She bolted upright, gasping, her hand flying to her chest as she scrambled backward on the bed. "Mr. Rowe, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I was cleaning and I sat down for just a second and I—" "Stop," Segwon said, his voice low and even, the same tone he used when negotiating with men who thought they had leverage they didn't actually possess. She froze, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts that bordered on hyperventilation. Her gaze darted around the room like she was looking for an escape route, mapping out exits, calculating whether she could make it to the door before he stopped her. "Who did this to you?" Segwon asked, his eyes fixed on the bruises at her throat. Rena's mouth opened. Closed. She shook her head quickly, her curls bouncing with the motion. "It's nothing. I'll go. I'm so sorry, Mr. Rowe. I didn't mean to fall asleep in your bed. It won't happen again, I promise. Please don't fire me. I need this job. Please." "I asked you a question," Segwon said, his tone unchanged but with an undercurrent of steel that made grown men reconsider their life choices. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was a weight to his words, a gravity that came from years of being obeyed without question, from commanding an empire built on fear and respect in equal measure. It made her flinch, made her curl further into herself, and Segwon hated the way she recoiled from him like he was the threat she needed to fear most in this moment. "It's handled," Rena whispered, her voice cracking at the edges. "It won't happen again, I promise. I'll be more careful." "That's not what I asked," Segwon said, his patience thinning. She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in her lap, and Segwon noticed for the first time that her knuckles were scraped raw, the skin broken and bleeding in places. She'd fought back. Against whoever had done this to her, she'd fought, and that small detail made something fierce and dangerously protective flare in his chest. "Please," Rena said softly, still not meeting his eyes. "I just need to clean up and get back to work. I'm sorry I fell asleep. It won't happen again. I'll work extra hours to make up for it. "You're not working today," Segwan interrupted, standing up and taking a step back to give her space to make himself less threatening. Rena's head snapped up, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "What?" "Go to the guest room," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Shower. Rest. I'll have food brought to you." "Mr. Rowe, I can't. I need to—" "That wasn't a request," Segwan said firmly. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, but she didn't argue further. She knew better. She slid off the bed carefully, moving like every muscle in her body ached, wincing visibly as she put weight on her left leg. She limped toward the door, keeping her gaze fixed firmly on the floor, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself disappear. Segwan watched her go, his expression unreadable, his mind already working through calculations and plans and next steps. And then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Find out everything about Rena Okafor," he said when the line connected. His right-hand man, Minjun, knew better than to ask questions when Segwan used that particular tone. Where she came from, who she's running from, and who put their hands on her. I want names, addresses, everything. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of a pen scratching against a paper, the click of a keyboard. "How deep do you want me to dig, boss?" Minjun asked carefully. Segwan's gaze drifted to the bloodstain on his white pillowcase, stark and damning against the expensive Egyptian cotton. "All the way down," he said, his voice cold. "I want to know everything, and I want it by noon." By midday, Segwan had a file on his desk. It wasn't thick. Rena Okafor had clearly worked very hard to leave a minimal footprint in the world, but it was thorough. Minjun was exceptional at his job, which was precisely why he was still alive and prospering in an organization where incompetence was often a terminal condition. Segwan opened the file and began to read, his expression neutral, his mind cataloging every detail. Rena Okafor, 26 years old, Nigerian-American, born in Lagos, moved to the United States at age 12 when her father had secured a position with an international oil company, full scholarship to Northwestern University, degree in hospitality management with honors, no criminal record, no outstanding debts, no social media presence, at least not anymore. All her accounts had been systematically deleted approximately 3 months ago, each one scrubbed clean with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of genuine fear. But 3 months and 2 weeks ago, she'd filed a restraining order in Chicago, Illinois, against a man named Marcus Delano. Segwan's eyes narrowed as he read the details. Ex-boyfriend, 32 years old. History of domestic violence stretching back years across multiple relationships. Multiple complaints filed by multiple women, none of which had resulted in any serious jail time because Marcus Delano was connected, had family money, had lawyers who knew exactly how to make charges disappear. 2 assault charges that had been pleaded down to misdemeanors with suspended sentences. 1 charge that had been dropped entirely when the victim had suddenly refused to testify after receiving what the file delicately termed financial incentives. The restraining order had been granted by the court. Marcus had been ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Rena at all times, to have no contact, direct or indirect, to surrender any firearms he owned. And 2 weeks after the restraining order was issued, Rena Okafor had disappeared, quit her job at a boutique hotel where she'd been the assistant manager, broke her lease and forfeited her security deposit, withdrew all her savings in cash from 3 different bank accounts, sold her car for half its value to a buyer who didn't ask questions, and vanished into thin air. 3 weeks later, she'd turned up in Seoul with a new phone number, a new identity carefully constructed but not quite thorough enough to fool someone with Segwan's resources, and a job working for him. Segwan read the file twice, committing every detail to memory, every date, every name, every connection. Then he leaned back in his leather chair and stared at the ceiling of his office, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind working through the implications. He didn't do feelings, didn't do attachments, didn't allow personal considerations to interfere with business decisions. His world was built on power, control, and carefully calculated moves where every action served a strategic purpose. Every decision he made had been analyzed for risk and reward. Every relationship he maintained offered some form of value to his organization. He didn't get involved in other people's problems unless it directly benefited him or his empire. But the image of Rena's bruised face kept flashing in his mind like a warning light he couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't rationalize away. And the idea of someone, this Marcus Delano with his family money and his lawyers, and his history of hurting women with impunity, putting his hands on her, hurting her, driving her to flee halfway across the world just to feel safe, made something dark and violent stir in his chest. He didn't like the feeling. It was unfamiliar, unwelcome, potentially dangerous to the carefully controlled life he'd built, but he wasn't going to ignore it either. Later that evening, Seguin found Rena in the guest room. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights beginning to twinkle to life as dusk settled over Seoul like a blanket. She'd wrapped herself in one of the plush blankets from the bed, and she'd showered. He could tell from her damp hair and the fresh clothes she was wearing. One of his old t-shirts that had been left in the guest room dresser from months ago when he'd briefly considered having a guest, and then remembered he didn't actually like people enough to invite them into his space. Paired with sweatpants that were clearly too big for her, the waistband rolled several times to keep them from falling off her hips. The bruises were still there, stark and ugly against her brown skin, but she looked cleaner, calmer, still fragile like porcelain that had been cracked and glued back together, but less like she might shatter into 1,000 pieces at any moment. "You should eat," Seguin said from the doorway, his voice softer than usual. Rena turned, startled. She hadn't heard him approach, which spoke to either how lost in thought she'd been or how quietly he moved. Probably both. "I'm not hungry." "You need to eat anyway," he said, nodding toward the tray of food on the table beside her.
Soup, rice, grilled fish, steamed vegetables. Simple, easy to digest, nothing too heavy. He'd specifically requested the kitchen prepare something gentle for someone who might be dealing with pain. She looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she just nodded and reached for the tray with trembling hands. Seguin watched her for a moment, then stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with a quiet click. Rena's shoulders tensed immediately, her body language screaming discomfort even though she tried to hide it, while trying to keep her expression neutral. "I know about Marcus," Seguin said quietly, deciding that being direct was better than dancing around the subject and letting her anxiety build. Her fork clattered against the plate, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Mr. Rowe?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to explain," he continued, moving to stand by the window, deliberately giving her physical space even as he eliminated her emotional escape routes. "But you should know that he's not going to touch you again." Rena's eyes widened, genuine fear flickering across her face. "What did you do?" "Nothing yet," Seguin said calmly, his tone conversational despite the weight of his words. "But if he comes near you again, I will." "You can't." She shook her head quickly, setting the tray aside, her appetite clearly gone. "You don't understand. He's dangerous. He has connections, money, lawyers. If you get involved, if he finds out you know where I am—" "Rena," Seguin's voice cut through her panic like a blade, sharp and clean. "I'm more dangerous." She stared at him, her lips parted, her breathing shallow, and for the first time since he'd met her 4 months ago, she didn't immediately look away, didn't drop her gaze to the floor or find something fascinating about the wall to study. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Seguin felt something shift between them, something subtle but significant, like tectonic plates grinding against each other deep underground, building pressure that would eventually have to be released. Something dangerous, something inevitable. The following morning, Rena tried to go back to work. She appeared in the kitchen at 5:30, her cleaning supplies in hand, dressed in a fresh uniform that couldn't quite hide the bruises darkening on her skin, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd clearly tried to cover the worst of the marks on her face with makeup, but the swelling was too pronounced, the discoloration too severe. Seguin stopped her at the doorway to the living room. "You're still recovering," he said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "I'm fine," Rena insisted, lifting her chin in a show of defiance that would have been more effective if her hands weren't shaking visibly, if she wasn't favoring her left side, if her voice wasn't rough from her injured throat. "You're limping," Seguin observed. I can still clean, Rena said stubbornly. Rena. Sigwan stepped closer and she went very still, her breath catching audibly. Take the week off. Paid. Non-negotiable. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Why are you doing this? Because you work for me, Sigwan said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And I take care of what's mine. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge, layered with implications that went far beyond employer and employee. Rena's breath hitched audibly, her eyes widening, and Sigwan realized with a strange sense of certainty that felt both terrifying and inevitable that he meant every single word, not because she was his employee, but because somewhere in the past 4 months of her quiet presence in his home, somewhere between her careful invisibility and her determined efficiency, somewhere in the space between noticing her and not noticing her, she had become something more, something important, something worth protecting. If you're already hooked and desperate to know what happens next, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think Sigwan should do about Marcus. Your engagement keeps these stories coming, and I read every single comment.
Over the next few days, something fundamental changed in the dynamics of the penthouse. Sigwan found himself coming home earlier than usual, making excuses to leave meetings early, delegating tasks he would normally handle personally, found reasons to work from his home office instead of the downtown headquarters where his presence was usually required, found excuses to check in on Rena throughout the day, asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if the guest room was adequate, if the food was acceptable. He told himself it was practical. She was injured. She needed time to heal. It made sense to ensure she had everything necessary for her recovery. It was just good management of his household staff, nothing more. But the truth was harder to admit, even to himself. He liked having her there. Liked the way her presence softened the sharp edges of his world, liked the sound of her voice when she finally started talking to him, instead of just offering one-word responses designed to end conversations as quickly as possible. Liked the way she looked at him, not with the fear and calculation he saw in everyone else's eyes, not with the hunger for power or money or status that motivated most people in his orbit, but with something closer to genuine curiosity. And Rena, for her part, slowly began to let her guard down. She'd sit with him in the evenings, curled up on the opposite end of the couch while he worked on his laptop or made phone calls in Korean that she couldn't understand, but learned to ignore. They'd talk during meals, about nothing, about everything, about her life before Marcus, about Seoul and whether she liked living here, about American movies and Korean food and the strange cultural differences that sometimes made her laugh. He never talked about his work in detail, never explained exactly what he did, or why men bowed when he entered a room, or why people seemed to fear him even as they sought his favor, and she never asked, seemed to understand instinctively that some questions were better left unspoken, that some doors were better left unopened, and slowly, day by day, the bruises began to fade, but the connection between them only grew stronger. Sigwan started finding excuses to touch her, a hand on her lower back as they moved through the penthouse, fingers brushing as he handed her a cup of tea, sitting close enough on the couch that their shoulders touched. Small gestures that felt monumental in their significance. And Rena, who'd flinched from casual touch for so long, who'd learned to associate physical contact with pain and control, found herself leaning into it instead of away. 3 weeks later, when Sigwan had found her in his bed, everything shifted again. Rena had been attempting to cook dinner, trying to recreate a Nigerian jollof rice recipe from memory, something her mother used to make that tasted like home and comfort and safety, when Sigwan came up behind her in the kitchen. "You're going to burn it," he said, reaching past her to turn down the heat on the stove. Rena laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. "Have a little faith in my abilities." "I have faith in many things," Sigwan murmured, his voice close to her ear, his body warm against her back, close enough that she could feel the solid presence of him. "Your cooking is currently not one of them." "That's incredibly rude," Rena said, but she was smiling, her tone playful rather than offended. Sigwan's hands settled on her waist, a gentle weight that made her breath catch, and Rena went very still, hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. "Let me help,"
he said quietly, and for the next hour they cooked together in the massive kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that felt both natural and significant. Segwan chopped vegetables while Rena stirred the pot and added spices from memory. They argued playfully about seasoning levels and cooking times. They tasted each other's additions and made exaggerated faces of approval or mock disgust that made them both laugh. It felt domestic, normal, like something couples did together, like something that meant more than just preparing food. Neither of them commented on it, but both of them felt the shift, felt the moment stretch and become something neither of them could take back. When dinner was finally ready, and surprisingly edible despite their playful arguments, they sat at the kitchen island instead of the formal dining room, eating straight from the pot like conspirators, like people who didn't need formality between them. "This is actually good," Segwan admitted, sounding genuinely surprised. "Don't sound so shocked," Rena said, nudging him with her shoulder in a gesture that felt comfortable, familiar, intimate. He caught her hand almost reflexively, lacing their fingers together, and the playfulness faded, replaced by something heavier, more intense, more real. "Rena," Segwan said quietly. "Yeah?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I want you to stay here, not as my employee, as—" He trailed off, seeming uncertain how to finish the sentence, this man who was never uncertain about anything. "As what?" Rena prompted, her heart hammering so hard in her chest she was sure he could hear it. Segwan turned to face her fully, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. "As someone I care about, someone I want in my life, someone I want to wake up next to every morning." Rena's breath caught in her throat. "Segwan, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly, something almost vulnerable flickering across his usually controlled expression. "I know it's fast. I know you're still healing from what Marcus did, but I need you to know that this isn't casual for me. You're not casual for me. You're not just someone who works for me or someone I'm helping out of obligation." Rena looked down at their joined hands, her mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. It was too fast, too soon. She barely knew him, not really, not beyond the surface, and getting involved with someone like him, someone dangerous, someone powerful, someone who lived in a world of violence and moral ambiguity, was probably the worst decision she could possibly make. But when she looked up and met his eyes, she saw something that made all her logical objections crumble into dust. She saw the same vulnerability she felt, the same fear of rejection, the same desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be real and lasting and worth the risk. "Okay," Rena whispered. Segwan's eyes widened slightly. "Okay? I'll stay. Not in the guest room. With you," she clarified, her voice stronger now. "I'm scared. I'm terrified actually, but I want this." And the smile that broke across Segwan's face was the most beautiful thing Rena had ever seen, genuine and unguarded, and full of an emotion that looked a lot like joy. That night they lay in Segwan's bed together for the first time, deliberately, intentionally, as a choice rather than an accident of exhaustion. Segwan was on his back, one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling. Rena was curled on her side, facing him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his beat beneath her ear. "Tell me something nobody else knows about you," Rena said quietly into the comfortable darkness. Segwan was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder through the thin fabric of her borrowed shirt. "I'm afraid of ending up alone," Segwan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have power, money, respect, fear, everything a man in my position could want, but at the end of the day I go to sleep in an empty bed in an empty penthouse, and I wonder if this is all there is, if this is all I'm ever going to be, a man who controls everything and connects with nothing." Rena lifted her head to look at him properly, seeing something raw and honest in his expression that he probably rarely showed anyone. "You're not alone anymore."
"Neither are you," Segwan said, pulling her closer until there was no space between them, until they were tangled together in a way that felt permanent. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rena let herself believe that safety might actually be possible, that love might actually be real, that maybe she deserved something good after all the bad. The peace lasted exactly 13 days. 13 days of waking up next to Sewon, of learning the way he liked his coffee, of discovering that he was surprisingly gentle for a man with such a violent reputation. 13 days of building something that felt real and solid and worth protecting. And then Marcus found her again. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Sewon had left for a meeting downtown, business that couldn't be handled remotely, decisions that required his physical presence. He'd been reluctant to go, had made Rena promise to stay in the penthouse, had left 2 of his most trusted men stationed outside the building. "I'll be back in 3 hours," he'd said, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that still surprised her every time. 4 at most. Don't leave the building, don't answer the door for anyone except Minjun. Promise me. "I promise," Rena had said, touched by his concern even as part of her wondered if he was being slightly paranoid. She wasn't wondering anymore. 2 hours after Sewon left, there was a knock at the penthouse door. Rena looked up from her book, frowning. Minjun would have called first, that was protocol. The other guards knew not to disturb her unless there was an emergency. She moved to the door carefully and peered through the peephole, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Marcus stood in the hallway, looking exactly as she remembered him, tall and handsome in that conventional way that had once made her heart flutter and now just made her stomach turn with nausea. Dressed in an expensive suit, his hair perfectly styled, his smile charming and cold and practiced. The scratch marks she'd left on his face had healed, leaving no evidence of their last encounter. "I know you're in there, baby," Marcus called out, his voice carrying through the door with false warmth. "We need to talk. I came all this way. Don't be rude." Rena backed away from the door, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. This wasn't possible. He couldn't be here. The building had security. Sewon had people watching. How had he gotten past them? "Rena, come on," Marcus continued, his tone patient and reasonable, the same tone he'd used right before the violence started, the tone that used to make her second-guess her own reality. "Don't make this difficult. I just want to talk. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." She pulled up Sewon's number with trembling fingers. Before she could dial, she heard a crash that made her jump. Marcus had kicked the door, the impact reverberating through the entire penthouse. "Open the fucking door, Rena." His voice had changed completely, all pretense of charm evaporating in an instant. "I know you're in there hiding like a coward. You think you can just run away from me? You think some Korean gangster is going to protect you? Is that what this is? You're whoring yourself out for protection?" Another kick. The door shuddered but held. Rena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone, could barely see the screen through the tears blurring her vision. She dialed Sewon. He answered on the first ring, his voice instantly alert. "Rena, what's wrong?" "He's here," she whispered, her voice breaking with terror. "Marcus is here. He's trying to break down the door. Sewon, I don't know how he got past security, I don't know how he found me, but he's here and he's—" The sound of Marcus kicking the door again cut off her words. She heard Sewon say something sharp and violent in Korean to someone else, then heard the sound of a car engine roaring to life in the background. "Lock yourself in the bathroom," Sewon said, his voice deadly calm in that way that meant he was absolutely furious. "Right now. Don't come out until I get there. I'm 8 minutes away. Can you get to the bathroom?" "Yes," Rena breathed. "Then go, now. And Rena," his voice softened slightly, "I'm coming for you. He's not going to touch you, I promise." Rena ran. She made it to the master bathroom just as she heard the penthouse door finally give way with a splintering crash of wood and metal. She locked the bathroom door with shaking hands, backed into the corner of the large shower stall, and tried to breathe through the panic clawing at her chest like a living thing. She could hear Marcus moving through the penthouse, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, calling her name in that sing-song voice that made her skin crawl. "Baby, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk. You know I love you. You know we belong together. Why did you make me chase you all the way to Korea? That wasn't very nice, Rena. That wasn't nice at all. Do you know how much money I spent tracking you down? How many people I had to pay? You owe me." Footsteps getting closer, methodically checking each room. Come out, wherever you are," Marcus sing-songed, and Rena pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. The bathroom doorknob rattled violently.
"There you are," Marcus said, his voice right outside the door now, so close she could practically feel his presence through the wood. "Open up, baby. Don't make me break down another door. You know how that makes me angry. You know what happens when you make me angry." Rena closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and prayed that Segwan would get there in time, that 8 minutes hadn't been an optimistic estimate, that she wouldn't have to face Marcus alone again. The door shuddered under the impact of Marcus's shoulder. Once, twice, 3 times, each hit harder than the last. And then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Multiple voices shouting in Korean, aggressive and commanding. The sound of a violent struggle, Marcus cursing viciously, something heavy hitting the floor, the unmistakable sound of fists connecting with flesh. A gunshot, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Rena screamed. Then sudden, absolute silence. "Rena!" Segwan's voice, urgent and strained and absolutely furious. "Rena, it's me. Open the door. You're safe now." She stumbled forward on legs that barely supported her weight, fumbling with the lock with fingers that wouldn't cooperate, finally getting it open. Segwan stood there, his suit jacket gone, his shirt partially unbuttoned and spattered with blood, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Behind him, she could see Minjun and 2 other men restraining Marcus, who had a viciously bleeding nose, the beginning of what would be spectacular black eyes, and a split lip that was still dripping blood onto Segwan's expensive floor. "Are you hurt?" Segwan demanded immediately, his hands on her face, her shoulders, checking her over frantically for injuries. "Did he touch you? Did he get his hands on you?" No, Rena stammered, her whole body shaking. I'm okay. You got here in time." Segwan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his heart racing against her cheek. Then he turned his head and his expression transformed into something cold and absolutely murderous as he looked at Marcus, who was struggling against the men holding him. "Take him downstairs to the basement," Segwan said quietly in English, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, flat and cold in a way that was more terrifying than any amount of shouting. "You're in my city now," Segwan said, his voice still terrifyingly calm, "in my territory, and you just broke into my home and terrorized the woman I love. You have no rights here. You have nothing here except what I decide to give you." He turned back to Rena, his expression softening instantly as he cupped her face gently. "I need to handle this. Minjun will stay with you. Don't come downstairs. What I'm about to do, you don't need to see it." "Segwan," Rena started. "Trust me," he said quietly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "This ends tonight. He'll never come near you again, I promise." Rena didn't see what happened in the basement, didn't want to know the details, but she heard Marcus screaming for the first 20 minutes, heard him begging after that, heard him weeping toward the end, and then silence. She sat in the living room with Minjun, who pretended not to notice when she flinched at every sound, who quietly made her tea she couldn't drink and offered her snacks she couldn't eat. When Segwan finally returned 3 hours later, his shirt was gone, there was blood on his hands and forearms that he hadn't bothered to wash off, and his expression was still cold and distant, like he'd gone somewhere inside himself that had nothing to do with humanity or mercy. "Is he dead?" Rena asked quietly, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Segwan moved to the bar, poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and downed it in 1 swallow before answering. "No." "Are you going to kill him?" "Do you want me to?" Segwan asked, turning to face her, his dark eyes searching hers for an answer. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and consequences and the weight of choice. Rena thought about it. I really thought about it. Thought about 3 years of systematic abuse, of being controlled and manipulated and hurt. Thought about running halfway across the world and still not being safe. Thought about the terror she'd felt hearing Marcus kick down the door today. Thought about what might have happened if Segwan hadn't gotten there in time. "I want him never to be able to hurt another woman again," she said finally, carefully. "I want him to understand that what he did was wrong. I want him to face consequences for once in his privileged life. But I don't want you to become a murderer because of me. I don't want that weight on your soul." Segwan's lips quivered in something that wasn't quite a smile. Rena, I've been a murderer long before I met you. My soul has carried that weight for years. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth of it in his eyes, in the set of his shoulders, in the blood still staining his skin, and realized she didn't care. Maybe that made her broken too. Maybe Marcus had damaged her more fundamentally than she'd realized, or maybe she'd finally accepted that the world wasn't black and white, that monsters sometimes saved you, and good men sometimes destroyed you, that morality was more complicated than she'd been taught to believe. "What are you going to do with him?" she asked. Segwan set down his empty glass with deliberate care. "I'm going to make sure he leaves Korea tonight on a plane back to Chicago. I'm going to make sure he understands with absolute clarity that if he ever comes near you again, if he ever tries to contact you, if he even thinks about you, I will find him and I will end him in ways that will make what happened tonight seem merciful by comparison." He moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his, despite the blood still on his skin. "I'm going to have people watching him for the rest of his life," Segwan continued quietly, "and if he ever raises his hand to another woman, if I hear even a whisper that he's reverting to old patterns, my people will make him wish he'd never been born. He'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, knowing that one mistake means I'll come for him." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Is that acceptable?" Rena squeezed his hand, feeling the solid warmth of him, the reality of his presence, the promise in his words. "Yes." "Good," Segwan said. "He'll be on a plane in 2 hours. You'll never see him again. I give you my word." And Rena believed him absolutely. That night, neither of them could sleep.
They lay in Segwan's bed, freshly cleaned and stripped of any reminder of Marcus's violation of their space, staring at the ceiling, both too wired and traumatized to relax. Around 2 a.m, Rena finally spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me, for protecting me, for being there when I needed you most." Segwan rolled onto his side to face her. "You don't need to thank me for that. Protecting you isn't a favor or an obligation. It's just what I do, what I'll always do." "Why?" Rena asked, the question she'd been holding back for weeks finally escaping. "Why do you care so much about me? I'm nobody special. I'm just—" "Stop," Segwan interrupted, his voice firm. "Don't ever diminish yourself like that. You're not nobody. You're not just anything." He reached out, cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You're the first person in my entire life who's ever made me want to be better. The first person who's looked at me and seen something worth saving beneath all the violence and blood and darkness. The first person who's made me believe that maybe I'm capable of something other than destruction." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I love you, Rena, completely, absolutely. In a way I didn't think I was capable of loving anyone, and I would burn down my entire empire if that's what it took to keep you safe." Rena's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were good tears, healing tears, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming emotion. "I love you too," she whispered back. "Even though you're terrifying and dangerous and completely insane, I love you." And when Segwan kissed her, it tasted like promises and redemption and a future neither of them had dared to imagine before. They made love that night with a desperation and intensity that felt like claiming, like healing, like two broken people putting each other back together one touch at a time. Segwan was gentle despite his nature, careful with her despite the violence still humming through his veins from the evening's events. He took his time, worshiping every inch of her skin, murmuring words in Korean that she didn't understand but felt in her bones. And Rena let herself be vulnerable in a way she never had before. Let herself trust completely. Let herself believe that this was real and lasting and worth every risk. Afterward, they lay tangled together, breathless and satisfied, and finally at peace. "Move in with me," Segwan said suddenly. Not as my maid, not as someone who's staying temporarily, as my partner, as someone who belongs here. Rena propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. I already live here. Officially, Segwan clarified. I want everyone to know you're mine. I want the world to understand that you're under my protection, that you're not just someone who works for me or someone I'm helping temporarily. I want them to know that touching you means declaring war on me. That's intense, Rena said, but she was smiling. I'm an intense person, Segwan said unapologetically. I've noticed, Rena replied, leaning down to kiss him softly. Okay, I'll officially move in, on one condition. Name it. I want to keep working, Rena said. Not cleaning, but I want a job, a purpose. I want to feel like I'm contributing something, like I'm building something for myself. I don't want to just be Rose Segwan's girlfriend for the rest of my life. Segwan's expression softened with something that looked a lot like pride. Of course. What do you want to do? I have a degree in hospitality management, Rena said. I want to use it. Maybe work at one of the hotels in the city. Build my career properly. Done, Segwan said. I'll make some calls, but you'll interview on your own merits. I won't buy you the position. You'll earn it. Thank you, Rena said, her heart swelling with affection for this complicated, violent, surprisingly thoughtful man. But Rena, Segwan added, his tone serious. Yeah? You're not just going to be my girlfriend. Her heart skipped. What? Segwan pulled her closer, his dark eyes intense and unwavering. Eventually, when you're ready, when enough time has passed, when you feel safe enough, I'm going to ask you to marry me. And I'm going to keep asking until you say yes. Rena's breath caught in her throat. Segwan, I'm not asking now, he said quickly. I know it's too soon. I know you need time to heal, to feel secure, to build your own life here. But I want you to know my intentions. I want you to know that this isn't casual or temporary for me. You're it, Rena. You're everything. And looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute conviction there, Rena felt something inside her chest settle into place like a puzzle piece she'd been missing her entire life. Okay, she whispered. Segwan's smile was brighter than the Seoul sunrise beginning to light the sky outside their window. 3 months later, Rena stood in Segwan's penthouse getting ready for her first day at the Latte Hotel, where she'd been hired as an assistant manager. She'd interviewed twice, had been put through a rigorous skills assessment, had competed against 12 other qualified candidates, and she'd gotten the position on her own merits, her own qualifications, her own determination. Segwan had kept his word. He hadn't interfered, hadn't made calls, hadn't used his influence. He'd simply supported her, helped her prepare for interviews, celebrated when she got the job offer. You look beautiful, Segwan said from the doorway, watching her adjust her professional outfit in the mirror. I look nervous, Rena corrected, but she was smiling. That too, Segwan admitted, but you're going to be amazing. They're lucky to have you. He crossed the room, stood behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist. They looked good together in the mirror, his tall frame behind her smaller one, his dark suit complementing her professional dress, two people who'd found each other against all odds. Thank you, Rena said softly, for believing in me, for giving me space to become myself again, for not trying to control me or keep me locked away. You're not something to be controlled or locked away, Segwan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're someone to be partnered with, supported, loved. Rena turned in his arms, stood on her toes, and kissed him deeply. I love you, she said. My dangerous, complicated, surprisingly sweet Korean Mafia boss. I love you too, Segwan replied. My strong, beautiful survivor who fell asleep on my bed and changed my entire life. And as Rena headed out to start her new job, her new life, her new future, she realized that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, that sometimes being broken is just the first step toward being rebuilt into something stronger, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in Seoul is exactly the safe haven you needed all along. 1 year after that first morning when Seguan had found her bruised and sleeping in his bed, he took her back to that same balcony where they'd shared so many conversations, so many stolen moments. The Seoul skyline glittered before them like scattered diamonds. "Rina," Seguan said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn to face him. He was kneeling, holding a ring that caught the city lights and threw them back in 1,000 directions. "I know I said I'd wait until you were ready," Seguan said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But I wake up every morning certain that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I go to sleep every night grateful that you chose me despite everything I am. And I don't want to wait any longer to make this official." He took a breath. "Marry me, Rina. Be my wife, my partner, my everything. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice when you trusted me with your broken pieces. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved, fiercely and completely, and without reservation." Rina's eyes filled with tears, happy tears this time, joyful tears, tears of a future finally within reach. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Yes." Seguan stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like forever. And as they stood there on that balcony, wrapped in each other's arms, Rina realized that this was what safety felt like. This was what love looked like. This was what home meant. Not a place, but a person. The most dangerous man in Seoul who'd proven to be the safest place she'd ever known. If you loved this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intense romance like this. Drop your thoughts below. I read every single comment and love hearing from you. What did you think of Seguan and Rina's journey? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next story. Thanks for watching.